Grüß, willkommen in einem anderen Fragens-Video. Welcome to another exciting video, in this case episode 34 of my game system design video series. In this video I will look at what a unit is and what function does it have in a set of figure gaming rules. While the concept of a base of elements is self-explanatory, the concept of a unit is less well defined. Why do rules use units? What are their purpose, and what can you normally do with units? My original video only covered micro armour or World War II, Cold War and moderns, but in this updated version I'll expand that to include pike and musket and ancient rules, although these will not be covered in the same level of detail. Purposes of this video is to understand what a unit is in any form of figure gaming. The term unit is not as clear-cut as it seems, and often rules will use the unit to describe a specific game function as well as some form of historical formation. This can cause no end of confusion, and some rules attempt to minimize this by using more specific terms, such as combat unit to describe the game function and unit to describe a historical formation. While the term rules is often used and seems self-explanatory, it can be hard to understand what the term unit actually represents in a set of rules. Is it a physical unit made up of multiple elements? Or is it being used in a general sense? This causes me issues, often, in learning rules. In order to understand this or clarify this, we need to start with the typical atomic element in any set of rules, which in figure gaming is often called an element, counter or base. In board gaming, it's often called a counter. This is a specific definition and represents the smallest physical object a player will pick up, move and conduct combat with. In the world of ancients and pike and muskets, these elements, or atomic elements, are often a single base made of cardboard, plastic, wood, or these days MDF, on which are mounted metal or plastic figures. For World War II, Cold War and moderns, it's often just the metal or plastic figure, specifically tank, truck, etc. A figure can be, but is often not specifically an element. In the ancient gaming era of airfixed plastic models, this was certainly the case, that is, the figure was the element. And even ancients and pike and musket, this occurred with metal figures. However, the early formal rules for this period generally recommended the figures be mounted on some form of standard size base, either one or multiple figures. This was not the case generally with World War II, Cold War and modern, with the possible exception of 6mm infantry. Many players prefer not to base their vehicles for a host of reasons. However, putting aside this nuance, in most cases an element or base is identified by the figure or figures mounted on it. This identification tells the player what the element's movement and combat capability is. In some cases, you may need to keep track of strength points, but this is rare and each strength point is still related to the figure on the elements, or figures on the element. This works very well at squad scale and even at platoon scale. When we move to company or battalion scale, each element can consist of more than a single weapon type. Thus, a heavy weapon element can consist of machine guns or mortars, and at very different ratios. So how do you determine what its combat capability is? This does not tend to be an issue for ancients or musket and pike, but is certainly an issue for World War II, Cold War and moderns. In most rules at this scale, you simply ignore the difference and just call it a heavy weapons company with the same combat capability of any other heavy weapons company, irrespective of the actual weapons that are contained within it. This is a valid but may be unsatisfying to some players. The other issue at this scale is weapon types which do not exist in large enough numbers to be reflected on the playing area. For example, an attached platoon of mortars would be rounded down to nothing. Thus, you never field a mortar platoon in this particular formation or on the playing area. The easiest solution in this case is to ignore the difference. All heavy weapon companies are the same by nationality. All infantry battalions are the same by nationality. You would set its combat value in the same way board game designers do, by gut feel or some algorithm perhaps. When we have a large difference in numbers of tanks or men, our company needs instead represents the number of men or vehicles, and you divide accordingly. So 3 Soviet companies of 10 tanks get merged into 2 standard element sizes of 15 tanks each. This is a valid strategy and does work, but the loss of all these fractions may be rather annoying to some players. If you as a rule designers do not like losing your fractions, simply consolidate upwards. 3 companies with 4 mortars each would consolidate all 12 mortars into a mortar company at battalion level. 4 anti-tank guns at battalion level gets consolidated upwards to an anti-tank company at regimental level. This can then be attached downward as per the player's desire. This would allow you to field most of these low number element types, assuming this was even an important thing that you wanted to resolve. Anti-aircraft guns attached at headquarters level may be an issue, but these could be consolidated into any existing anti-aircraft formation. This is the better solution, but means you need to make some effort putting together army lists. One simple solution is to determine the highest level formation which you'll be fielding. So if your highest level formation is a division, then total all the troops you'll be using in the entire division and then divide by whatever multiple you've selected. Let's say it's 15. Round to the closest to obtain the total number of elements and then break up into your component regiments and battalions using gut feel allocation and common sense. This is not going to give you an exactly accurate breakdown, but when an element consists of 15 vehicles or 150 men, this is probably not possible. One of the systems I use these days is to take an actual THEORIE and use a points system from a set of platoon or squad set of rules and convert it into some sort of holistic points total. I normally use the points system in Corps Commander, but any squad or platoon scale point system would work. You then divide this value by the scale of the rules. So if it's company scale and a company has a points value of 175 points, you divide this by 50 to arrive at a value of 4, which is what that company's strength would be. The company type would be determined by the predominant equipment within that company. At battalion scale, you could use the same points system technique, but the element types are more restrictive. This does mean you'll have multiple different combat strengths per element, thus that may need some tracking. This technique is actually used for musket and pike quite a bit, especially if the scale you're using is large, such as 1,000 or 2,000 men per element. At this scale, cavalry formations can easily be rounded down to nothing, so total all the cavalry in a corps, for example, and determine how many elements that would result in, which could give you your cavalry total in elements. If you want more accuracy, then aggregate your forces only 2 levels above the element. Thus, a set of rules where each element represents a company would consolidate everything into a parent regiment and then divide by, in this case, 15. Players would then build their battalions as they wish. A battalion scale set of rules would need to consolidate divisional level and a regimental scale of rules at corps level. I personally feel regimental scale set of rules may be a bit of a stretch unless you use a big base approach, which we'll discuss in more detail. However, I must admit, since I've created this video originally, I have developed a regimental scale set of World War II rules, and it seems to work reasonably well. When we move to very high scales with simple rules, the figure on the element only nominally represents what is in the unit. If we have a scale of 1 battalion per element, then an element with a tank on it may represent a light, medium or heavy tank, and perhaps each class has 3 grades, superior, ordinary or inferior. This is a system commonly used with figure gaming rules, which were converted from board games. I'm not a great fan of that, but it's certainly an option. In this case, the figure represents a specific combat strength rather than the figure on the base. Irrespective, the principle remains the same. The figure on the element tells the player the combat and movement capability of that element. Either it's simple or either that player will have to cross-reference it with a sheet, but nonetheless it tells the player what the attack, defense and movement capability of the element represents or is. This kind of abstract system is commonly used in Ancients, with a Greek player using one type of hoplite figures to represent ordinary spearmen and a different type, perhaps Spartan hoplites, to represent superior spearmen. Each of these element types have different combat values. We have done the element to death. Let's now look at the unit. What is a unit in figure gaming terms? In simple terms, it's a collection of elements which are normally in base-to-base contact with each other. This was certainly the way units operated in early Ancients and musket and pike rules. However, this was rarely the case for early World War II Cold War or modern rules. More modern rules, which use a higher scale, have adopted this multi-element unit approach. So rules such as LWRS uses the concept of combat units, which represent multiple elements which normally are in base-to-base contact with each other. It is possible in some rules for a unit to only consist of a single base or element in addition. The basic unit or combat unit consists of a number of standard elements in base-to-base contact or very close to each other. The unit fights and moves as one. A player can quickly see what is in the unit, and casualties result in standard elements being removed. Panzer Corps does this, and LWRS does this also to an extent. This works with the battalion scale rules, but as the standard elements are actually companies, you would call this probably a company scale set of rules. The ground scale is certainly company scale, but the manoeuvre scale is battalion, because you're manoeuvring a bunch of elements. In many of these types of rules, you could use a movement tray to represent your unit, placing the elements within that movement tray. If, on the other hand, you want a single element to represent a battalion, a lot of averaging is required, and the solution of totaling up everything in the highest level formation fielded is the best solution in this case. In simple terms, the unit is actually the smallest combat element a player can use, with the elements, in some cases, acting as strength points, or in some cases, one element being a unit. A unit could consist of different element types, which gives you additional flexibility. However, in early rules, this was generally discouraged. If we look at ancients, a unit of hoplites consists of only hoplite elements. In some rare cases, you can have different troop type combinations, as occurred with early Persians, but each figure type was normally placed on the same element. So they just represented a new, unique element type. More modern rules allow you to mix different troop types into a combat unit. An early issue was combat. If a unit was in contact with more than one enemy unit, how would combat occur? Does the unit fight as a whole or by individual elements? In most cases, the easy solution was used. Combat was conducted by elements, not by units, but morale effects were by unit. This sort of worked and had many benefits. A typical game could consist of no more than 50 elements per side. However, if these elements were grouped into units, it was possible to field, let's say, 24 units, each of 4 elements, giving you 96 elements. This was good for figure manufacturers, but did not give the player much benefit for all the effort involved in painting up so many figures. Strangely enough, over the last 20 years, ancient rules have changed the concept of unit massively, with any collection of elements representing a unit, assuming all elements were in base-to-base contact with each other. In this case, they could move as a unit. This was regulated by command rules or something like pips. This works for ancients and suits the type of games ancient players normally had. Equal point battles on a flat area, with the primary interest being the rock, scissor, paper effect of the troop types when they met in combat. Musket and pike rules over the last 20 years generally retain the old concept of units, especially lower scale rules. However, as we see, more modern rules have moved on to new types of units, the big base, movement tray or big counter system. A new type of rules structure or unit structure had developed in the last 20 years, which in rules terms is the concept of the big base. In simple terms, this means you have a large base or movement tray and you place all your elements in it. A player can look at the elements and determine the big base's movement or combat value. Initially, I considered this as a large element, but I now realise this is basically a unit. However, instead of elements being in base-to-base contact with each other, they are placed in a movement tray. Creating a big element, let's say 9 centimeters by 9 centimeters, which can hold up to 9 standard element-sized elements, the standard size element acts as a strength point. The standard element allows you to represent those smaller volume weapons, so a mortar element would represent 12 mortars, and provide the big unit its unique combat benefit. This gives the big element specific combat features. You now have a number of battalions, each of which can be unique. Players could use unit trays, which allow you to slot 9 elements in them. But as with the previous solution, the element scale remains, in this case, company. We have not achieved the objective of representing a battalion with a single element, but this system does offer many benefits. I must point out for World War II Cold War moderns, 9-element combat unit is very large indeed. I found in this type of gaming the optimal tray should only hold 4 elements, which is 6 centimeters by 6 centimeters square, which gives you a reasonable big base approach. Larger movement trays causes issue with terrain and playing area size. Basically, all terrain pieces need to be as big as the large movement tray, which means you have to customize that. Ancients never really adopted this type of movement tray big base approach in the most part, but musket and pike certainly has recently. In the world of musket and pike, they have taken it to new levels of abstract adoption, with a large cardboard counter representing a unit and figures almost being optional. If figures are used as either strength points or something similar, or are simply there for bling, they really don't serve any real purpose, and you could replace them with a board game counter. That's the only real disadvantage. But you can still, if you want the bling, have the figures there. Both the multi-element and big unit systems have benefits and disadvantages. A final system is to combine both systems together. If the combat unit is a regiment, then all weapons in that regiment are totaled and divided by the scale multiplier, perhaps 30 vehicles, guns, or 300 men. Fractions are rounded to the closest whole number, and all these elements represent the regiment. Each regiment does not represent a formation, but the collection of elements represents a formation, which in this case is the regiment. Rules designers could force all elements to remain in base-to-base contact or allow them to separate up to some maximum distance from a headquarters element. Either system works, with the latter being simpler, but the former allowing for more rapid play, that is, with movement trays, allows you with more rapid play. At a scale of 30 vehicles, guns or 300 men, the element scale is half battalion, so you're not really designing a one element is a battalion scale game. But we are now able to play a half battalion scale game which allows play to determine the combat capability of an element just by looking at the element. This avoids off-playing area record keeping and allows for more support elements to be deployed, a bigger range of figures. It's getting a little bit confusing at this point, so let's do a midpoint summary of the two unit systems, multi-element or big base. While the multi-element unit or big element system could be used with company scale rules, I feel the best option is to stay with independent elements and consolidate upwards. For battalion scale, we have an interesting decision. If players do not like the disadvantages of a big element system, they could utilise the combined multi-element and big element system and force all elements to remain in base-to-base combat. There's no movement tray, you just simply have the elements in base-to-base combat. This would reduce the size of the force mixes, but would avoid the problem of off-playing area record keeping. That is, you don't need to track the strength of your unit. You look at the elements which are all in base-to-base contact with each other. However, at this point, we may ask ourselves, why do we even need a unit? Rules such as DBN allow a player to form up to 12-point core-size formations where elements may or may not remain in base-to-base contact with each other. The unit has now become whatever random elements are available and close enough to each other and that can operate together in some manner as a unit. This idea comes from Ancient's DBA, but DBN takes it to the next level. The unit, if you wish to call it that, is now a core, which only has the purpose of being a convenient building block for your army. So far I've covered a lot of history and different definitions of what units are. Let's attempt to break down the unit groupings and why they are used. Once we understand why a unit is employed, then we can understand how to use units in, let's say, newly designed rules, which you may be designing. If we see no benefit, then we can dispense with the whole entire concept, at least in terms of game mechanics. So now, in final summary, there are two basic types of units. The unit which moves as a unit, but elements within it fight individually, and the unit which moves and fight as a unit, but elements within it are strength points, or there are no elements within it, it's simply a single element which represents the unit. The most common early use of units used them as basic movement and reaction elements. In simple terms, a unit moves as a single entity and in many cases also conducts morale, reaction or quality tests as a single entity. In this situation, the way the element was organised in a unit gave players an idea of the formation. This is most common in musket and pike, where units form line, column and square. In ancients less so, but the idea of rear elements supporting those in the front was normally linked to the unit. The benefit of this system is that it allows you to deploy a lot more elements on the playing area. An optimal game should consist of no more than 50 elements. If the elements are grouped into units which conduct actions together, this total could be dramatically increased. In most cases, doubling the number of elements a player could comfortably deploy. Elements still fought individually, so it was not as if the unit now took the place of the element, but it got you to about halfway point. Of course, we may ask ourselves, if this was the real benefit, and instead more related to having a nice and busy playing area. The other benefit of this solution was formations. This means you do not need counters to indicate if a unit was in square, line or column. When you really drill down, this only affects the square formations in musket and pike, as a line can be any single depth element and a column any element with other elements to its rear. The benefits are minimal, but for musket and pike at a low scale, it is seen as extremely useful, particularly in forming up squares. The next type of unit uses the element as steps or strength points. The unit moves and fights, the element only indicates its strength. This is the big base or movement tray unit concept. This also allows you to deploy a lot more elements on your playing area. The number of units or movement trays should still be restricted to 50 or more commonly 24, but as many elements as you wish could be placed in either movement tray or big base. I'm uncertain if this is an advantage, but if the rules require strength point markers, using elements as a strength point marker is a good system. I was originally very excited about big bases, but have cooled to the concept a great deal over the last couple of years. The movement tray is normally rather large, which restricts how many movement trays you can field. If a movement tray can hold 9 elements, often a playing area will find it difficult to field more than 24 of these large units. If the movement tray holds 3 or 4 elements, we reach a reasonable middle ground and can field more units. The main benefit of movement tray was to allow you to avoid strength point markers and the ability to craft a unit with specific troop types. However, if this resulted in less units, you may find your operational choices greatly reduced. I think this works very well if you want a very simple game system which can play really quick games. The other benefit of the system was it allows players to refight larger battles, with each movement tray or big base representing a division, for example. However, as we've discussed, we may not be able to deploy many of these division-sized units due to the lack of playing area space. We have 3 basic benefits: more figures, formations, that's the ability to represent a formation in the playing area, or similar, and allowing you to fight larger battles while retaining historical detail. I do not consider having more figures as a benefit. This can be achieved by the use of larger elements and the placement of more than one rank on each element. I also feel the ability to indicate formations without counters has merit, but only if the game system impact is minor. In this case, it's not minor and formations can be indicated using other techniques, or the rules can simply ignore the whole concept of formations. Having a simple movement and more complex combat system is a benefit if that's your objective. This is a good method of increasing realism without unnecessary complexity. The larger battles, or also quicker battles, is another good benefit. If this is your objective, then adopting a big base or movement tray unit is a good solution. The third option is to not use formal or fixed units. Many of the secondary benefits of units can be achieved in a simpler manner. The classic example is DBM and DBMM. The unit forms and dissolves as required. What is important is the final location of the elements at any particular point in time. There is no specific requirement for units in figure gaming, unless you have specifically designed or specific design issues you wish to solve by the use of units. So in conclusion, the game concept of units is a game system feature which should only be used if you have a specific issue you wish to solve or achieve. I also can't help but feel units, or the concept of a unit with multiple elements, were created originally from musket and pike rules. People wanted their favourite regiment or battalion, and it only seemed logical to have a unit made up of a number of different elements which represented that particular formation. When it was implemented in ancient gaming, it never seemed right. While cohorts could be considered a unit, the early maniples were too small to be a multi-element unit, and if they represented an element, then the unit became the whole legion. It never felt right in this area, which is probably why it was abandoned by DBM and DBMM. In World War II, Cold War and moderns, it was never popular, although later high-scale rules do attempt to use multi-element units. So we come to a conclusion of my episode 34, my video on game system design, in this case trying to understand what a unit is and when you should use different types of units in a set of rules. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.